Hey, I am Mustafa Sharif. Thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. I'm looking forward to this episode, both the topic and the guest. The guest is one of my friends. We studied together in the Master Urban Planning and Design in Stockholm. I have the pleasure to welcome you, Peng, to Urbanistica podcast.
Hi, Mustafa.
So tell me, how are you?
I'm well. I'm well. I mean, as well as anyone can be in this, really weird, concerning times. But family is healthy, and I'm healthy. So that's the most that anybody can really ask for right now.
Yes,
I'm very thankful for that.
I'm happy to hear that. And thank you so much for giving your time for the podcast.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Well, Peng, you're gonna be the storyteller of this episode. How would you
Okay.
like to introduce yourself and tell me what are you passionate about?
Sure. Well, I guess so. My name is Peng Wu. I am a immigrant from the U.S. I was originally born in China, but then I moved to US when I was very young, 7 years old. And I stayed in the US all that time up until 2013 when I emigrated here to Stockholm. And once I came to Stockholm, I decided to change careers and I wanted to pursue something of a dream career of mine, which was urban planning and design. So after studying the same program as you, I finished and now I basically, well, I am an urban planner. So it's been a really long and strange journey. And as to what I'm passionate about, um, I think it's a combination of things. Very simply, storytelling is one, which is why I'm very happy to be on this podcast with you. And in combination with that is the history in general, and very specifically cities and planning, because I think putting all those together really creates a really interesting um, profile on how to approach urban planning and design. Um, so when I started, because of my interest in history, I was more qualitative. I approached things towards a more qualitative, from a more qualitative angle. But slowly, I started to kind of embrace the more quantitative side. So now I am branched out. I've branched out into more data analysis, GIS projects, trying to approach the city from more analyze the city and its people from a more quantitative point of view rather than a qualitative point of view. Although I try, have to do both. You can't just do one or the other. You have to try to combine them.
Yes, exactly. Super interesting journey, but what was you mentioned that the career change, what you were doing before becoming an urban planner.
Well, so for 10 years in New York, I worked in the maritime sector, so logistics basically. And I worked in a company that owned and managed large cargo ships, bulk cargo. So, our uh, it's pretty hard to explain quickly, but basically, if there's any material that you have in your hands right now, chances are it's passed through an ocean ship of some kind. And I was part of the kind of the industry that kept the global trade kind of humming along. But the company that I worked for dealt mostly in bulk cargo, so wheat, soybeans, iron ore, coal, nickel. You know, really large amounts of ships. Like our ships, our largest ships that we managed were 300 meters long. So that's
Wow.
an insane amount of
Yes.
yeah. Um, but yeah, it was a very, very interesting and challenging job. And I learned a lot about logistics. It gave me a really strong background in logistics. But I wanted to kind of challenge myself in a different way. So I moved here. And after moving here, I decided to try to pursue urban planning because I wanted to get more uh, yeah, I was always passionate about having being a New Yorker. I was always passionate about the city and always really fascinated by how the city worked and the very fact that it worked at all, because New York is so chaotic,
Yes.
right? So it's always a kind of a dream of mine to understand more about it. So that's why I decided to change careers, and yeah, it was a really good change. I think.
Yes, I also agree with you. It was a really, really great change. Well, to highlight one more time, this episode is more about that Peng tell his story about the life in New York and then the life in Stockholm. Then we try
Sure,
to compare in between the cities and see what works here and what works there and see if we
sure,
can learn from each other. So
sure.
let's start, Peng, with New York. Explain to us like the life there in between buildings.
Well, yeah, it depends on which buildings. I think New York is, everybody has an idea of New York because it's world famous. So much art and literature is set there, and it feels like people could feel like they've been to New York without having set foot there at all. But New York is just a vast assemblage of people. And I know this podcast is all about buildings, but for me, the important part of things have always been the people in the buildings. And New York is home to just one of the greatest collections of people around the world. So you have, uh, you know, people from anywhere, any corner of the globe, you can find in New York. And that creates this really uh, dynamic, insane energy that is just hard to describe and exists in so few places. But in New York, to be part of that, to be part of that life in between the buildings of this constant moving and pulsating uh, crowd of people is it's a really it's a very it's a hard experience to describe. But um, because New York is so big, there's so many diverse pockets of it. So the place where I grew up is in Queens, Elmhurst. Um, in fact, it's the place right now that is the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak in New York. But when I grew up, it was one of the most diverse places on the planet. So in the 1990 census, the US Census, you could see that every single country, every single country was represented in that place, not just the borough of Queens, but in my neighborhood in Elmhurst. So you had 200 something countries, people from 200 something countries living in that tiny, very small area. But it was not what you would think of as New York, because the buildings there, for the most part, were what used to be single family homes. But they've been subdivided and divided further into small rooms. So you actually have sometimes 3 or 4 families living in one house that was originally built for one family. So the American, typical American white picket fences, clapboard house, um, you would have that, but inside of that house, you would have multiple families from different countries sometimes just living together side by side. So it was a very interesting experience, I guess, because for me, when I grew up, I was used to not hearing, not understanding what people were saying, because people didn't speak English as a first language sometimes. They spoke all sorts of different languages, and I couldn't understand a lot of that. So to grow up that in that way, I think is quite unique, and it is. I think it really left a deep impression on me. Uh, so yeah, that's growing up there is.
Yes, and I'm wondering how was the community like the relationship between the people from different countries. You mentioned that they speak different languages and so on, but could you feel the how to say the neighbors that there is people in between buildings and the buildings?
I would say, well, first, I mean, being a new immigrant, your closest neighbors are, of course, people from your own country, because you share the same language, you share the same understanding of the world. Um, but gradually, I mean, when I went to school, I went to a public school, there were people from, everywhere there. So my friends in elementary school and in junior high school were from all sorts of different countries. Um, as for neighbors, I mean, you know, in a big city, it's it's not the same as being in a smaller town, I guess, where people get to know their neighbors really well. Um, but you do uh, in times of, I guess, crisis, you do get a sense of closeness with each other, but it's not as tight knit as one would imagine. But you know, you have to develop a certain sense of tolerance. I feel like um, when you grow up there or when you're living there, and that I think accounts for a little bit for the neighborliness that you would have.
Yeah. And how, when you're growing up, where was your school close to the place you were living at, or did you need to take transportation?
Uh, my first school was just a block over, so I could just walk there. It took 5 minutes. That was great. My second school, my junior high school, I had to take a bus for about 25 minutes, and that was further in Queens. And then when I went to high school, I took the subway to go to the very downward tip of Manhattan, and that took an hour and a half. So you get further and further away.
Yes, yes. But let's start with the first one. You were walking to the school.
Yeah.
Did you need to cross a lot of wide streets and being
No,
scared by cars and?
no, I think you figure. I mean, the joke that I tell, and it's a very bad joke, but it's is that is to a New Yorker, you know, a green light means you can walk across the street, but a red light means you just have to run across the street. As a child, you know, you of course there's schools usually would post crossing guards, so there are people who you know stand in the crossroads and help not the cars but help the children across and things like that. And we had some of those sometimes, but the street that I had to cross wasn't very crowded, so it was very easy. Um, and yeah, so but I mean, you get used to cars very quickly, which can be good and bad. I actually had a friend uh, in fifth grade. He was actually run over by a car. So you know, it is a dangerous. It can be a dangerous place for
Yeah,
pedestrians. But as a child, you kind of get used to it.
yes.
You adapt.
And were you thinking about biking to school or walking was?
No, I mean back in where I grew up, early 90s, mid 90s, late 90s, even up to the 2000s, you know, biking really wasn't something that you did. There just wasn't a biking culture. And because, yeah, the streets were pretty dangerous. So, uh, yeah, biking was just not something that you would do,
Yeah.
especially
And
for long distances.
yeah, talking about the streets, how was the structure of the section of the streets you were living in?
So, New York mostly, especially Manhattan, but in the part of Queens where I lived, is very grid like. So it's very grid, you know, right angles, and a lot of the streets are numbered. But in Queens, however, it's not numbered in a very logical way, because in Queens they had really wider, farther apart streets, streets that are farther apart. But then as it more people moved in, they built more streets. So instead of renumbering everything, they just started putting different names of streets. So you would have 19th Street and 20th Street, and then suddenly there would be three different two streets in between, and they would name it 19th Lane or 19th Avenue, and then you go to 20th. So it's quite funny in Queens. It's very easy to get lost there because for someone from Manhattan. But yeah, it's very grid like. One thing that you don't see often here in Stockholm is one way streets. But in Queens, you very often see that. I live on a one way street, so I guess that helped with the traffic safety because you only have to pay attention for
Exactly, one
cars
side.
from one side. Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great. And was there any, like here in Sweden, we call it first level shops, like the stores in the bottom, the
That
first floor?
depends. Yeah, I mean that's very common. It depends on what area you're in. If you're in a mostly residential area, then no. Like the areas that I lived in were there were single family houses, so surrounded by like small yard or the front yard and things like that. So there wasn't that there. But in most of the areas where you have apartments, I'm talking multi-story, like 3 or 4 story apartments, then yeah, you would have stores at the bottom, and I mean, that was just natural for me. It took coming to places like Sweden to realize that that's not actually how the rest of the world looked. But I just
Yes.
would assume that if you have an apartment, then at the bottom there is a pizzeria or a bodega or a laundromat or whatever. Um, so that's very yeah, that was very common.
Yes. And how was the life in the street? Were you meeting friends and like just having, let's say, a Coca-Cola on the street, like, or you were most at home?
Well, it depended on what age. I think as I got older, my mom trusted me to be more out because I mean we were immigrants. My mother worked all the time, so I was a latchkey kid from very young age. But when I was in elementary school, I didn't really go out that much because I was only 8 or 9, and she didn't feel safe for me to be out. But as I went to junior high school, which is the school that's farther away, I had more chances to go explore after school. And yeah, then you just gather with your group of friends and you just wander down the various streets, either around the school or if there are people who live near you that took the same bus, then you be on the same bus, of course, and then you get off at the bus stop and then you spread out and go to the mall or go to the stores around the mall or just hang around the streets and just generally
Yeah,
be a teenager.
exactly. So it was okay to meet and like have a chat at on the street. You don't need to go inside a coffee shop.
I think for as a child, it's not something that you would do. I remember, and this dates me very much so, but I remember arcades were the place to be. So, we had arcade machines, Street
Yes.
Fighter, Mortal Kombat, whatever. And that was where you would hang out because the arcade owners would be tolerant of a bunch of young teenagers, very loud, lacking in money, just hanging around, very rarely buying stuff, but and buying very small things like pieces of gum or candy and things like that.
Yeah.
Um, so no, we didn't do coffee shops or anything like that. It was mostly just the small little, very small corner stores or arcades, or just going into the mall. I think the mall was the alternative. You would go into there's a very big mall right next to where I live, Queen Center Mall. It's one of the busiest malls in New York City, actually. And they had a huge food court, so you can go into the food court and sit down, and even if you didn't buy anything, very few people would harass you. And there's always, the electronic stores or the computer game stores that you can browse and not ever buy anything at. Uh, uh, so yeah, that's the pattern
Yeah.
of
W-
life.
Yes. What was your favorite arcade game?
Oh, I think definitely, Mortal Kombat. Because I was, yeah, you were a teenage boy, and when people tell kids, oh, you can't have it, because it was so controversial back then, and you could sort of understand why, because it was so bloody and violent. Like I wouldn't let my son play it now, but you just, yeah, that was definitely, I spent the most amount of money per machine on that game.
I can I can imagine. But then
Yeah.
when you grow up, it started more used to like the metro, more being out of your, how to say,
Yes.
what do you call it, quarter, like home.
Yeah, neighborhood. So yeah, definitely by the time I went to high school, New York City was my neighborhood. And the best part about New York is that there is no, and same thing now here in Stockholm, there was no zone system for the tickets. So I remember as a student, I think the last 2 or 3 years, they gave you a Metro card, which is the card that you use to get past the turnstiles, and you get 3 free rides every day. So first ride was for you to get from home to school, and the second ride was for you to get from school to wherever, and then the last ride was to get from wherever back home. So it was really perfect for kids. And yeah, after school, if we didn't have a lot of homework, just kind of find a place to explore in New York. And any place the subway went, you can go. And that was really, a wonderful, amazing feeling. I remember the first time, you know, I did that. I think I went to Central Park by myself. Actually, no, it was with my friends, and it was just a blew my mind that I could just go anywhere after school. Of course, I had to let my mom know that I was coming home, but
Yes, yes.
but other than that, the world's your oyster, as they say. Uh, and New York is a great city, even if you're a child with no money. Of course, it's much better if you have money, but you could still hang around the streets. You can still go. A lot of places are a lot of museums you can go into with very little money, and um, yeah, it was really 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 great
Yeah.
to go up there.
And we talked a lot about how, like, when you grow up from a child to teenager, and when you started like to study university and then start to work,
Hmm.
how was your, let's say, city life pattern?
Well, I mean, I went to university in a completely opposite place from New York. So I went to a very small liberal arts college in the middle of Ohio. So yeah, I saw like fields, which is,
Completely different, huh?
oh yeah, yeah. So it made me really appreciate uh, New York life much more, because I mean, I, like a true New Yorker, I can't drive. I still can't drive. It's actually pretty embarrassing. I should be driving. I'm learning how to drive, but I'm like almost 40 and I can't drive. But in New York, if you couldn't get someplace by subway, bus, or taxi, then it's not worth getting to. So, and when I was in Ohio, I was completely trapped. Everything
Yes.
was car dependent. Yeah, you just need to have a car.
Yeah.
Um, so I really that was a big shock. And coming back to New York, it really made me appreciate New York that much more. But the daily commuting life didn't really change. I never lived in Manhattan. I always lived out in the outer boroughs, so Queens, and then eventually Brooklyn. So for me, going to work was in Manhattan. So every day you had the same subway ride, 45 minutes to an hour, and end of the day you come back and it's the same pattern as when I was in school. So it really didn't change that much.
Yeah. Uh, the in New York, do you need, like, can you survive with just like taking public transportation, or you need to have a
Absolutely.
car?
No, absolutely. In New York is one of the few cities in America where you can absolutely be fine with no car. And if you need to have a car, you can always rent a car. But yeah, there's absolutely no need for a car.
Yes.
I think several of my friends who still live in New York, I mean, they're my age, they still can't drive. They don't have a car. So
Yes.
yeah, it's the one of the defining characteristics because of its density and the just sheer amount of services, and because of the great coverage of public transportation there, is that you can get to anything via public transportation. And if you can't, just take a taxi, or now it's an Uber, but whatever, or Lyft.
Yeah. Is it cheap?
Public transportation, well, that depends. I think comparatively, it is slightly cheaper than, like, if you have a monthly card for unlimited access to the public transportation system, it is probably slightly cheaper than Sweden. Sorry, in Stockholm. Um, so it is not inexpensive. Uh, I mean, I haven't lived there in 5 years, but the last time I bought one of these monthly cards, it was $100 something for 30 days, and that's about, I don't know, 1,000 kroners now.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know. I haven't bought a
Mm.
30-day card in Stockholm for a long time either,
Yeah.
thanks to the coronavirus. So I completely forgot how much it cost.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
So let's move to Stockholm.
yeah, sure.
You took the flight.
Yeah, took the flight. I arrived, and so I did not actually stay in city center. The first apartment that we lived in was Donderud. It was a friend's apartment. So it was the first time that I actually lived in anything like, it was a suburb. Um, so I lived right next to Morby Centrum, and it was really eye-opening, because the place I had lived in previously, uh, in Brooklyn, I mean, if you wanted to see a forest, walk like 8, 9 blocks to Prospect Park, and then there's some forest, some trees. But then, you're in the middle of a bunch of brownstones and apartment buildings. But when I landed in Donderud, it was like the apartments were in the middle of forests, and it blew my mind. Uh, I just couldn't believe the amount of trees that were here, and there's trees everywhere. Um, so that was extremely cool. Growing up, I didn't really have access to uh, nature the way that a Stockholmer growing up here would. So it was fantastic for me to just go out and just be in the middle of the forest, and feel you can breathe the fresh air.
Yeah,
Uh,
was it weird because like suddenly you're just in the middle of the forest and you're
it
not
was
used to it, right?
Yeah, it took a bit of adjusting. And I mean, I had, because I had been in school in Ohio, knew, I mean, yeah, I was somewhat used to being in the middle of nowhere. But Donderud wasn't in the middle of nowhere. Of course, you were a 10-minute walk away from the tunnelbana.
Yeah,
So
from
uh,
from the metro station.
exactly. But the thing that was weird was, the feeling that you were in the middle of nowhere, but you're not. You're actually quite close to the center of Stockholm. That was very weird, because, within 15 minutes of getting on the train, you're in Östermalmstorg, and that was difficult to process, because I had been in places that were in the middle of nowhere, that were really in the middle of nowhere, but this was the first place I've been in that felt like the middle of nowhere, but was actually quite central. So that was quite interesting.
Yeah, and how, let's talk about the community or the neighborhood. How did you find it? Is it a big difference between people
Yeah,
in Scandinavia and Sweden?
I think. Yeah, I mean, so of course, every place is different, and the people there, of course, customs and everything are different. I think the fact that it's just not very dense here, that you can spread out as much as you want, creates a different type of feeling, than being in New York, where, if you're working in Manhattan, you have to be around people. There is absolutely no choice, and you run into people that you like, don't like, strangers all the time. That is not the case here, especially when I was living in Danderud. You can have a lot of personal space here in Stockholm, if you want to. You can just go to Hagaparken, 10, 15 minutes away uh, from the center of town, and just be lost in a forest. Whereas in New York, it's much more difficult, because even Central Park, being Central Park, this is, sure, it's green, but there's just a ton of people there, all uh, especially if the weather's nice. So it's a very different feeling of kind of, if you want to be apart from other people, you can very easily do it here in Stockholm, which is not the case, I feel like, in New York. Yeah,
Yes, and let's get back to your joke. Can you
yeah.
tell it about Stockholm? Also, the same joke about passing the green light and the
I
red light.
I don't think so. I think, I mean, well, it's all about Vision Zero here, right? So that's a very bad. We do not want to talk about it that way. But yeah, I mean, I think so Stockholm is a big city, and big city people are the same. So it's not like there's no jaywalking here. Uh, but I would feel much safer jaywalking here than in New York. In fact, I'm still paranoid about jaywalking or crossing the street here in Stockholm because 25 years of being in the US has always taught me that the car always has priority. So you need to stop for the car. But here, a lot of people just, when they get to the crossing, they just go.
Yeah.
So I still don't do that. I still sometimes get into these strange dances with with the drivers, and they'll stop, and I'm stopping, and they're like, "Where are you stopping?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't want to get hit." Like, "Well, it's Stockholm, we won't get hit." Um, so yeah, that's
Y- Yeah, that's funny.
yeah,
And how about we talked a bit about the biking culture.
sure.
Um, how is it like? Did you start to bike here in Stockholm, and how is it back home if you talk with your friends?
So so the funny thing is, when I right before I moved to Stockholm, maybe the 5 or 6 years before then, there was an increasingly strong push to promote biking in New York. So they installed a lot of bike lanes, um, and really kind of try to get people to bike on a daily basis. Um, and but even then, I think it's just not the same type of culture here, where biking is acceptable to go from where I live, which is Järfälla, to work in the middle of town just on bike. I mean, it take you like an hour, but sure, that's fine, or like 45 minutes, but sure, people would do that. But in New York, I think it's much more reluctant. I think people are more reluctant to do it. Um, I have a lot of friends who bike now in New York. I never was a biker, big biker. In fact, I didn't learn to bike until I was 32. Uh, so only a couple of years before I moved to Stockholm. And even then, I bought this brand new shiny bike and never really used it because it was kind of scary to bike in New York. Um, the streets were often very narrow in certain places, and the bike lanes that they paint, they're not they're just lanes that they paint. So there's
Yeah,
really nothing stopping a car from just kind of going right into you. Um, and people park in them all the time. Uh, so you can't really even stay on the bike lanes. You have to kind of swerve off and back on. So it's quite a dicey proposition compared to here, where it's amazing. It's night and day. The biking culture here is very strong. It's very supported by the at all levels of government and policy, and people do it for real. And you see little kids biking to school too, which is I would say still quite uncommon in New York. Um, but yeah, very, very different. I
yeah,
definitely like it better here in terms of the biking.
yeah. And can you also survive in Stockholm if you don't have a car?
Well, we did for a year. I think definitely in the middle of middle of the city, yes, you can, no question. Just the density of services and the fact that the public transportation, especially the bus network, is so good. Yeah, you're absolutely fine. Uh, Living out in the suburbs where we are in Järfälla, it's slightly more dicey, and it's even more difficult, I think, if you have a family, because of various logistics of doing large shopping trips and things like that. But I think definitely in Stockholm you can. Uh, yeah, and I know
Yeah,
there are many Stockholmers who can't drive, who don't own a car.
yeah,
So it's yeah, very much so.
yes. And I was wondering about when you arrived to Stockholm and after a few months, do you still feel that Stockholm is like little cute city compared to New York?
I I mean, I wouldn't call it cute. I would think I really love Stockholm as a city. I think it has the same type of uh, advantages that New York has, but it's just not in as many places. So in New York City, there are very many places where if you live there and you want to get up to trouble, meet your friends for a drink at 1 in the morning or whatever on a Tuesday night, you can do that. But in Stockholm, there are not as many places. So that's the one of the big differences is the density of services, and but I don't feel Stockholm is cute. I think it's a lovely city. I think cute kind of diminishes it a little bit, and yeah, I don't want to diminish it. It's very it's a great city to live in, and the kind of the lagom culture is for me at my age is much more suitable to me than being in the go 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 culture of New York. Uh,
Yeah. And if you we have a lot of many listeners from the US, what do you mean by lagom?
so lagom is I think the best description would be just right or middle of the road. So not too much, not too little. The Goldilocks principle. You don't not too much porridge, not too little porridge, just right. That is lagom. So you don't want to do things to an excess, one way or the other, but just kind of keep it calm and middle of the road. That's
Yeah, yeah,
one I
yeah.
understand.
Yes. What do you miss from New York that you wish to be that these things would be in Stockholm?
Uh, First and foremost is I guess food. So greatest thing about New York when I was living there was that if you could have a craving for any type of cuisine, you find, if not the best in the world, then one of the best in the world, or at least an example of it in New York. Um, and it's usually within like a 30 block radius, and you can just call it up, have them do a delivery, and it'll end up right in front of your house, in like 20 minutes. Here in Stockholm, it's much more of a challenge. And it's not to say there's not good food here, there is, but it's just not as available and not as ubiquitous. Um, so I think definitely food is the big. I mean, when I first moved here, I people assume New Yorkers love like pizza and bagel, and I love that stuff like that. I love bagels and I love pizza, but the one thing that I absolutely missed was a pastrami sandwich. And pastrami is a type of smoked meat, and I used to have them all the time in New York. You can't really find them here in Stockholm. So I was just craving them nonstop. Uh, and it took, I mean, every chance I go back to New York, I try to eat a pastrami sandwich or two to get your fill. But um, so yeah, I think food is one of for me personally, the thing
Yeah,
that
of course,
I
of
miss
course.
a
This is
lot.
your story.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Uh,
what are the other things, Ping?
I think and this is, of course, has to do with my age because I grew up in New York. I was young there. I was in my 20s in New York and early 30s. So I really got to know kind of I don't say the arts scene, but the kind of the cultural scene in general. Um, and in Stockholm, of course, there's not as many people, and the culture is different. The arts are different, and I didn't grow up here, so I didn't have that same type of um, common knowledge that a young person growing up in Stockholm would have of the arts scene. So yeah, that's something that I miss is to be able to go out and see underground theater shows and find the latest kind of speakeasy openings or whatever. That stuff is kind of you need to be a real local in order to start to get
Yeah.
to to know those things. And I missed that because I came here too late.
Yeah, I understand. I understand. And if
Yeah,
we talk from the urban planning and design point of
sure.
view, what are the things that could be done here, like New York?
Mm. Well, I think one of the things that really struck me about Stockholm was the how the ethnic enclaves were structured. In New York, of course, you can find enclaves of every culture, every country um, around the whole city. Um, I lived Elmhurst is now one of the main Chinatowns. There are a bunch of Chinatowns all around New York, and I lived in Elmhurst is one of them. And so living in one of the Chinatowns, you get used to being around Chinese culture and things like that. But the enclaves in New York are, in a sense, spatially much more open and integrated with the rest of the city than the enclaves here in Stockholm, which is quite interesting, because the enclaves here are very centered in the suburbs that were built during the Million Homes program. And there was a very specific typology that revolved around some of these areas, where they started out from a core of very dense apartment buildings with some sort of public transport in the middle, either bus or very often the subway, and then kind of gets less and less dense to smaller row houses, and then finally forest. And then these areas are kind of insulated from each other, so you have little bubbles of them along the subway line or along the bus line, but they're not kind of woven together in a with with buildings and with city life like you would have in New York. So, for example, from my neighborhood, Elmhurst, to the neighboring neighborhood of Corona, which is a predominantly Hispanic population, or it was when I was there. You know, geographically, there was no barrier. Like you just walk down a bunch of streets, and eventually you would end up from a place that has a lot of Chinese signs to a lot of Spanish signs. So you could very easily go from one section to the other. But here, it's hard. It's not the same. And I think that's something that needs to be considered. The kind of the spatial divisions uh, that support that undergird this very diverse city. Stockholm is very diverse, um, uh, and but the way that this diversity is spread out and kind of dispersed is not the same as in New York. So I don't think you get the same level of contact. I don't think you get the same level of familiarity that people would have with different cultures and different languages and different peoples that you would have in New York.
Yes, very, very interesting. Do you think that Stockholm is moving toward more like putting together, let's say, areas than being separated?
I think that's difficult to answer. I think one of the things that makes uh, it possible is less restrictive organization. I think immigrants, no matter where they end up, they usually end up in places that are on the margins, just simply because there's space for us here at the margins. But Sweden, the urban planning here is quite regulated, and it's very definitely has its strong sides. So no doubt about that. But the thing about that is that there aren't as many cracks for people to kind of find their niche in. So, like for example, the Elmhurst, the neighborhood I grew up, you needed to have people moving into these single family houses and then subdividing them to make room for 4 families, 5 families in a place where only one family is supposed to live. That's not something I think that would be uh, approved of here in Stockholm. I don't. I think it would be very strictly controlled, and I know it's strictly controlled actually. But in New York, you can get away with more things like that, even if the laws say one thing or the other. It's the enforcement of it is something else. So uh, I think um, the model has to change slightly in order for Stockholm to become more like New York, which is more kind of densely woven together, where different communities and neighborhoods are woven together much more closely, or knitted together. But I mean, to be frank, I don't know if that is the way that it's hard to imagine that that will happen, because Stockholm has a certain form, has a certain history to it, and it'll develop according to this form. And to change it is a little I think there would be a lot of challenges associated with it, and you might lose what Stockholm
Yeah,
would be
the
if
the
you did
char
that.
the character of the city.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Peng, it was really interesting to hear the story, and I would love that. Maybe we need a few more episodes to dig deep in different aspects.
Yeah,
If
yeah. New York is huge city. I lived there for a very long time. I maybe have been to like a quarter of it, a third. So it's a world unto itself. Uh,
Yes,
yeah.
yes. How how do you define a smart city?
How do I define a smart city?
You have been traveling in so many different cities
Yeah.
and living in different cities. So, what is a smart city for you?
A smart city for me is a city that gives um, knowledge and uh, the ability to shape its environment to its citizens. So I don't think it has anything to do with technology. I think an informal settlement, if it has the right human structures, if it has the right political structures, can be a smart city than anything that Google Sidewalks Labs can come up with, because it's all about empowering the people. Um, I mean, I think that the idea of the smart city as a technologically driven city is, um, yeah, I don't think it could quite work in reality because, you know, to a certain extent, all cities are smart because it allows their residents to make a life, to earn a living, and to get around, to navigate. And any city that helps people do that, I think, is a smart city. It doesn't have to do with fiber or mass collection of data or tracking or anything like that. But the key link is how does this information get to the people who can use it, who need to use it? And that's what a smart city is. A smart city is a city that does that and does it
Yeah,
well.
yeah, very interesting. Do you think that do you experience that Stockholm is a smart city?
I think in many ways it can be a smart city. Actually, it is. I mean, a lot of the innovations that you would get, just taking for example public transportation, just the ability to know when a train is coming, when a bus is coming, and rely on it. That's great. Having on your phone, or it doesn't even have to be on your app, but you know that at a certain time you will have transport to go from where you are to where you need to go. That's amazingly great. So yes, I think Stockholm is in many ways a smart city. Uh, um, but it's not just because of its technology, but I think it is smart city because the structure of it, the governing structure of it, is quite responsive, from what I've learned and from what I've observed, compared to a lot of different places in the world. So it takes its citizens' concerns seriously and it reflects it. And the citizens can get information from
Yeah,
uh, the government and from various different sources, and they can easily use it and put it to use.
yes, yes. Well, Peng, super interesting, and I would love that we
Yeah,
keep talking about this 24/7.
yeah.
So now we are almost in the end of this episode, let's say.
Sure.
So what is the next step for you?
Um, I mean, now professionally, it's a bit challenging because of the Corona and COVID. I think for me personally, I want to continue to develop my uh, data analytic skills. So that's kind of a big, quarantine challenge for me is to use this time uh, to develop those skills. Um, and I also just am looking forward to being able to travel again. Not travel like getting on a plane, but just even to go around the city. That's one of my favorite things to do is to go around to a place in Stockholm or New York or wherever, that I've never been to before. And just sit down and observe that place and have a coffee. You know, those things are a little bit not recommended as
Yeah.
of now. So I'm looking forward to that ending, so I can do that once again and kind of
Yes.
resume one of my favorite hobbies.
That's amazing. How would you like to summarize what we talked about this episode and some of your reflection and three takeaway messages?
I think takeaway one is uh, the uniqueness of each city, Stockholm and New York, and I mean all the other cities in the world. I think you can compare them, but I don't think you can rank them. I think to to do that, you have to have a a set of uh, criteria that doesn't change over time. That is kind of completely frozen, but people aren't that way. So for me, I loved living in New York when I was in my 20s and growing up in New York. But I really love Stockholm now because it has so many things that New York doesn't have. So there is no full criteria that will rank these two cities for me. Um, Number two is uh, kind of is to kind of be open to new experiences. I think being in Stockholm has really taught me a new way of looking at what a city is. I think if you live in one place for too long, it kind of really jams up your perception, and you kind of get your views kind of get fossilized. So things must be this way. But having lived in these two places, I think I can do a good comparison of not just pros and cons, but just the differences, and and see them in a new light. And the last takeaway would be, yeah, I would really love to have more restaurants that serve pastrami sandwiches in Stockholm. I think that would be a great development
Yeah.
if you could have that in Stockholm. So
Then
that
you
would
will
make that.
then you will never go back to New York.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that, but there would be one less reason to go back to New York.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Pink.
Thank you, Mustafa. I really
Now,
appreciate it.
now it's time for the three hashtags.
Oh, hashtags. Do they have to be real hashtags?
No, you just no, just make
Okay. Hashtag one. I mean, related to smart cities. Hashtag smart people.
cool.
And then second hashtag. Oh, it's got to be more pastrami, right? More pastrami is my second hashtag. More pastrami all the time. And third hashtag is oh, third hashtag is I don't know. I have to give a shout out to New York. I mean, New York is really suffering right now because of coronavirus. I mean, it's been super hard hit. It's the hardest hit part in the entire United States. So I think you know, I love New York. Hashtag I love New York. It kind of says it all because it really, you know, it really hurts to see the city like it is, where the streets are completely empty and the people are locked in. And I just hope that things get much better soon, and that people are safely coming out
Yeah,
enjoy the city life as it was. And it will never be the same it was. I think coronavirus changed a lot of stuff, but
of course.
people can try to get to a similar place
Yeah,
they had before.
it's a super tough time for all the cities and especially for New York. I think last week I had an interview with a doctor in New York hospital, and
Mm.
she started talking, and we just started to cry during the recording the episode because it's not easy, but hopefully things gonna get better.
Now, I have family working as doctors at Mount Sinai, and actually my cousin, who's the doctor, her boyfriend works in Elmhurst Hospital, which is right where I grew up, and it was the epicenter, and yeah, it is kind of it really is horrific. Thinking about the number of deaths that have occurred and just the illness. So yeah, hashtag I love New York. I hope things get better.
Yes.
And my love to everyone who's in New York right now.
Yeah, things will get better. And again, Peng, thank you so much for giving your time and for sharing your stories with us.
You're welcome, Mustafa. It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
My pleasure, and hopefully see you again in Stockholm.
All right. See you soon.
Thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. Don't forget to follow on Instagram and subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you have a great story that make our city smarter, please contact me. I am Mustafa Sharif. Have a good life.